Alma Lind had an orphaned niece to keep alive, a Nebraska winter coming on with no wood and no good sod to build against it, and a house of stacked hay the whole county was sure the first big wind would flatten. It was the winter of 1888, out in the sandhills of western Nebraska, where the grass grew tall and the wind never rested, and there was no timber for a house and no sod worth the cutting in the loose sand. Alma's husband, Nils, had died that summer. A well he was sinking caved in on him before anyone could reach him, and left her the raw claim, a horse mower, a barn's worth of wild hay, and her dead sister's girl, a quiet child of 10 named Inga, whom Alma had taken when there was no one else to take her. No husband, no wood, no lumber, and no money for any. The county watched Alma Lind cut and rake and stack great bales of the sandhill hay into walls, and they laughed. A house of hay, they said, in the sandhills, where the wind ran 100 miles without meeting a tree. The first blue norther of the winter would scatter the widow Lind's house across 3 counties, and her with it. By the time the January cold had gone through every thin plank house on that stretch of the hills and left families burning their furniture to hold one room, the same people who had laughed at the hay house would come floundering across the frozen sand to its door to be let into the warmest walls in the county. What none of them had thought, most of them lately come from timber country, where a wall was always boards, was the thing Alma had known in her hands since she was a girl in the old country. A thick wall of packed hay is one of the warmest walls in the world, warmer than plank, warmer than sod, because it is nothing but still trapped air, and still air is the finest blanket there is. Alma had grown up in a poor part of Sweden where hay was counted like money, and no scrap of warmth was ever wasted, and she knew what hay could do that the settlers around her, with their memories of forests, had never had to learn. She cut and cured the tall sandhill grass and pressed it into great tight bales, and she laid the bales up like enormous bricks, 2 courses thick, into walls higher than her head, and pinned them through with sharpened stakes driven down bale into bale to lock the wall together. Over the top, she set a light roof of poles and more hay, and she meant to plaster the whole outside, walls and all, with a skin of sandy mud and lime, to turn the wind and the wet and the spark, the way her grandmother had plastered the hay walls of the old country. That was the house, and the house was warm past believing from the first night. The thick hay walls holding the heat of one small stove so close and so well that the little room stayed snug while the sand outside went hard as iron. But Alma had made a mistake in the building of it, and the sand hills would make her pay for it before the plaster was ever on. She had raced the winter, and she had lost part of the race. She got the walls up and the roof on, and herself and the child moved in out of the first cold. But she left the plastering for a warm spell to work the mud in, and the warm spell did not come. And she had not yet weighted the pole roof down or pinned the topmost course of bales as hard as a real blow would ask. Out in the sandhills, the wind is not a thing you leave for later. In the black middle of one night, a dry blue norther came down off the plains with a scream in it, and it found the one weakness she had left it, the unfinished, unweighted top of the house, and it went to work to take the whole thing apart. Alma woke to the roof groaning and lifting, and the cold pouring in over her head. The norther had got in under the light pole roof at the windward corner and was heaving it, working it loose from the wall and tearing the loose hay off the unpinned top course and flinging it away into the dark. And the gap was widening over the very corner where Inga slept. A hay house half built is a haystack, and the wind knows it. Alma got the child up and wrapped and set in the lee corner farthest from the breach, and then she went up into the storm in the dark to save the house before the wind carried the roof off into Nebraska. She fought the norther for that roof the rest of the night. She dragged what weight she had up onto the poles, sacks of sand, the mower's iron, stones from the well pile, and roped the pole rafters down hard to stakes she drove into the wall, and packed the torn open top course with armload after armload of loose hay, and pinned it down as fast as the wind tore at it, working barehanded because no one can drive a stake or knot a rope in mittens, in a cold that took the feeling out of her hands, and then took more than the feeling. By dawn, the roof was down and lashed, and the breach closed, and the house still stood. But the child had lain hours in a corner, half open to the norther, and took a chill from it that went into a fever and frightened them both for a week. And Alma had frozen the ends of 2 fingers driving stakes in the wind, and lost a good part of the top course of hay to the dark, and she stood in the gray morning, knowing exactly what it had cost her to leave a thing half done in a country where the wind finishes what you don't. She understood it then. Hay is warm, and hay is strong, pinned and plastered and roofed tight. Hay unfinished is a haystack, and a haystack is the winds to scatter. She had built the warm half of her house and left the strong half for a better day, and the sandhill wind had very nearly handed the whole of it back to the grass it was cut from. There was a low week after, her fingers wrapped and the child feverish, when Alma nearly gave it up. A landman had been out that fall offering little for sandhill claims, and she thought of taking his little and carrying Inga to town before the winter or her own tiredness finished what the norther had started. She got as far as thinking it through. Then she looked at the thick, warm walls that had held even through the night the roof nearly went, walls the wind could not touch, whatever it did to the unfinished top, and the child sleeping warm again now the breach was closed, and she put the thought away. The house had shown her the price of leaving a thing half done. It had also kept a feverish child warm through the worst the sandhills could throw once she finished it. So she finished it. She plastered the whole house, walls and roof edge, in the cold, a skin of sandy mud and lime worked by cracked and frozen hands over days she could not spare, and weighted and pinned the roof against anything the plains could bring. After that, the norther could scream all it liked and find nothing left to take. By February, the hills were in real trouble. The cold held, and the thin plank houses failed one after another. A family 2 miles south burned the last of a hauled-in load of lumber, boards off their own walls, to keep a stove going. A young man alone lost his roof to a norther like the one that had nearly taken Alma's, and walked half-frozen through the night to the next claim. And through all of it, the widow Lind's hay house, finished now and plastered tight, sat warm as a burrow, the thick walls holding the heat of a handful of hay twists and cow chips against a cold that was emptying the county's woodpiles. It was a neighbor woman, one who had laughed as loud as any in the fall, who came first. Driven up the frozen hills, half ashamed to ask whether the hay house had room, her own board house gone too cold to hold her children. She stepped inside out of the wind and stopped, because the walls of hay she had mocked were holding a snug, even warmth on almost no fuel, and a feverish child was sleeping easy and warm, and the whole little house was as tight and quiet as the storm outside was wild. She asked how. She could not help asking how. Alma showed her. The thick pinned bales, the trapped still air, the plaster skin, the small stove that was enough. She showed her that the warmest wall in the county was the one they had all laughed at, and that a wall of packed hay would hold the heat of a poor woman's little fire the way a plank wall never could. The neighbor had come from a town in the east and had never once had to think what a wall was made to do. She was not the last. Word went through the frozen sandhills the way a warm thing goes through a cold place, and before the winter broke, Alma had taken a half-dozen families in out of the killing cold, up into the snug hay house, and shown any who asked how a hay wall is built and pinned and plastered so the wind cannot have it. Some began to build with hay themselves the next season, out there where there was no wood and never had been, and the ones who did were warmed the winter after, and the ones who clung to their thin, hauled-in boards went on being cold and calling it a proper house. Alma did not charge, and she did not gloat, and she kept the claim. Her 2 fingers healed stiff and pale, and Inga's fever broke and left her whole. And the hay house stood on that wind-swept claim for years, plastered fresh each fall, warm every winter, while the wind screamed around it and found nothing to scatter. "The wind will finish anything you leave half done out here," Alma used to say, "and it will scatter a haystack across 3 counties. But pin it and plaster it and roof it tight, And that same hay will keep you warmer than any board your money could buy. And the wind can scream at it till spring for all the good it does. If this story made you think of someone who built something warm and strong out of the thing everyone else called worthless, leave their name in the comments. And if you want to hear more of these stories, the women the frontier underestimated and what they quietly knew, subscribe. We tell them one at a time, and we don't rush them.